Our story opens with Kale, a young high school student, and his father Daniel fishing in a freshwater swamp. On their way home they get in a deadly three-way car accident and Daniel dies. That was 1 year ago now, and in the present day we see Kale sleep in a Spanish class. The teacher throws a whiteboard eraser at him to wake him up. He confronts Kale and asks him why you shouldn't fail him on the spot. Then he hits him with the "what would your father think?" So angry Kale punched teacher in the face. Then we're in court, we see Kale and his mother along with his teacher. The judge, aware of Kale's recent loss, sentences him to just 3 months of wearing a weird ankle bracelet. Back at home we see 2 officers fitting Kale with said bracelet. There is a 100-meter radius surrounding the GPS, and if he steps outside of the radius or unplugs it, the police bow come knocking in the event. Nothing better to do, Kale starts his 3 months by binging every episode of Minute Movies. Later his mom comes home disgusted at the environment he's been lazing around in. Relatable, out of frustration she cuts the cable connection and cancels his Roblox subscription. Kale spends the next few hours doing laundry, cleaning the. Later Kale wakes up to the sound of a moving truck and looks out his window to find a new family moving in next door. Later he assesses the GPS's range and plots out a makeshift barrier around the house so he knows where he's allowed to go. Suddenly he spots Ashley pulling up into her driveway, but because he's a beta male he ducks down under the bushes before rushing inside to avoid being seen. Afterwards he heads upstairs to have a peek at Ashley through the window. Few days later Ronnie, his best friend, knocks on the door. They haven't seen each other in ages, so Kale gives him a warm welcome. As they make their way up the stairs Kale explains what he's been doing the last few days. He hands Ronnie a pair of binoculars and reveals that he's been spying on his neighbors. Next up he leads Ronnie to the living room and shows him his favorite person to spy on. Later that day Kale can be seen doing a little reach around. This is the length he has to go through to not trigger that alarm. Suddenly Ashley appears and offers her help. The pair talk for a moment before her mom calls her away. That evening while his mom is dozing off he watches the news channel, discovering a recent kidnapping in the suburbs. Boring, so he spy on Ashley. He sees her dad barges into her room and shouts at her before slamming the door closed. After he sees that one of his neighbors, Mr. Turner, arrives home suspiciously late. As the neighbor gets back in his car and leaves, Cal notices that it's the same as the kidnapper's car described on the news. A Mustang with a dent on the front bumper sauce. The next day Kale decides to further investigate his suspicious neighbor. Later that day Ronnie is back at Kale's house. He tells him about the neighbor but ends up watching Ashley. Ronnie, who leans in a little too far, hit the glass and the 2 boys drop to the ground, fearing that she heard the bang. Kale peeks out the window again and he and Ashley make eye contact. Moments later the doorbell rings and the 2 boys stumble on their way down. After they open the door revealing Ashley, Ashley makes her way up to Gale's bedroom before grabbing his binoculars. After convincing her that they're only spying on Mr. Turner, he says how his car matches news descriptions, but when Ashley has a look she finds that the Defender is fine. Later that night the 3 teams set themselves up for stakeout. Ronnie gets a bunch of snooping equipment from his uncle and they proceed with a night of Susie spying. After a few hours of mindlessly watching, finally Mr. Turner pulls up. He opens the door of his car and leads his new friend inside. Then they thinks he's a sugar daddy, so the group ends up calling it a night and Cam walks Ashley back home. After returning to his room he immediately starts spying on Mr. Turner again. This time, upon looking through the camera he sees the woman running to escape the house. He begins recording the incident, but this dummy leaves the flash on. Filled with fear he drops to the ground and holds the camera above his head to see what's going on. He can't see anything, so he stands back up and looks through the binoculars only to see he is staring back at him. Then Kale's phone rings and he crawls across the floor to pick it up. It's Ronnie, so Kay frantically explains the situation, but as he's doing so he looks out and sees the girl getting back into her car and driving off. The next morning, and as he's making breakfast, suddenly the neighbor stands in front of him. Kale grabs his knife and questions what is he doing in his house, but then Kale's mother enters the room holding grocery bags and explaining that she ran into Mr. Turner. Anyway, his mom remembers that she left the milk in her car, so she heads back to get it. In the kitchen things get tense as Robert notices Kale's GPS tracker and questions what he did. Later Kale's mom returns with the milk. That evening Ashley hosts a party at her house while her parents are away. Naturally Kale gets back to his spying ways, and after a few minutes of peeping he spots another boy hugging and flirting with Ashley. In retaliation Kale decides to blast loud music from his rooftop to disrupt the party, but Ashley ends up jumping through his window to unplug the music and she even threatens to throw away his iPod. But then he admits to having been spying on her since she moved in. He tells her about all the small details of her personality that he's noticed, and somehow Ashley's totally into this, and they kiss. Unbeknownst to them, and right next door Robert's window has just been covered in blood. A few moments later they hear loud thoughts from outside their window. They look out and see the notorious neighbor dragging a bloody bag down his stairs. The next day they decide to investigate. Ronnie is tasked with breaking into his car to see what was in the bag. Meanwhile Ashley follows Robert as he shops so they know when he's on his way home. Ronnie manages to break into the car. When Cale's phone rings, Ashley suspecting that Robert is on his way home. Cale hurries Ronnie to feed him the password to the garage. Meanwhile, as Ashley is driving out of the parking lot, she runs into Tuner. Tuner tells her that he knows she's been following him and asks to leave him alone. Moment back at home, the three teens meet and discuss what to do next. Ashley tells them all to drop it, believing that they've taken things too far. Before the conversation can continue, she's once again called away by her mother. At night, determined Cale continues his investigation. He manages to find the blueprints for Robert's house and begins analyzing them. He develops a portable camera system that streams to his TV. As he's wrapping up, Ronnie comes telling he dropped his phone inside Tuner's car. Kayla agrees to help Ronnie get his phone, but first he needs him to break into Robert's garage. With camera in hand, Ronnie manages to find his phone, but Ronnie spots the bag in the corner of the room, exclaiming that it smells horrible. He can see hairs in it. Suddenly the garage door begins to close. Panicked, Ronnie runs into the house. In an effort to save his friend, Cale arms himself with the bat and runs over. Meanwhile, ankle bracelet go burr and police arrives. Cale tells his friend is in this creep's house and there's a body. Upon inspecting the blue bag, they find a dead deer that Tuner had hit with his car. Right back at home, Cale's scolded by his mom, who reminds him that he has court tomorrow. After she heads to Tuner's house to apologize. As Cale watches from his window, suddenly he gets a text message from Ronnie telling him to check his TV. Cale turns around and sees Ronnie lying unconscious through the screen. But it's all just a prank. Cale gets so mad at first, but Ronnie explains that he managed to get out of his house and didn't see anything suspicious inside. Cale ultimately forgives him and explains his mom went over to apologize to Tuner. Ronnie hands him the video camera so they can look over what happened. While watching alone, Cale notices something. He realized that the girl who got kidnapped. Just as he realizes this, his mom is attacked by Tuner, and it doesn't end there. He makes his way to Cale's house and plays baseball with Ronnie. Then goes upstairs to attack Cale, but his reflection betrays him, allowing Cale to dodge. He sprints upstairs and tries to unplug the GPS modem, but Tuner stops him. Cale gives it his all, but it just isn't enough. Instead, he decides to run outside in an effort to trigger the alarm. Once again, Tuner stops him, overpowering Cale and knocking him out. Cale wakes up in his bedroom as Tuner threatens to pin all his crimes onto him. Unfortunately, his tears have no effect on Tuner, and he forces him to write down an admission of guilt. But before he can, Ashley breaks into the house. This gives Cale one last chance to attack Tuner. Ashley joins in for a quick assist, and this gives the pair just enough time to barricade themselves. Ashley proceeds to free Cale while he explains that his mom is at Tuner's house. He plans to make his way across the GPS radius, but he's interrupted by Tuner. Before he snatches them up, the two teens jump out the bedroom into Ashley's pool, triggering the alarm on his foot. Then he dashes towards Tuner's house, breaking down the front door. Meanwhile, the officer is called to Cale's house, but he decides to finish his dinner before heading over. Back to Tuner's house. Cale frantically searches for his mom before uncovering the hidden crawl space under the house. He breaks open the vent and makes his way inside before realizing he's too big to fit. Then he hears a noise coming from somewhere else in the house and continues his search. He bangs on the walls before accidentally opening a hidden room. Inside, he discovers an operating table and multiple massive freezers. He spots the idea of the kidnapped club girl along with a red wig. He pushes aside the cupboard, revealing another hidden room. The officer arrives and hears noises within Tuner's house. He enters to investigate, only to be attacked and iced by Tuner. Back to Cale, he falls through the ground of the hidden room and into a pit of muddy water. He gets real cozy with all of Tuner's previous victims. Terrified, he makes his way out. Then he finds his mom, but before he can cut her free, Tuner quickly has Cale at death's door. But his mother's protective instincts come in clutch. Having now gained the upper hand, Cale gives Tuner a tummy tuck before throwing him down the hole. Soon more police pull up as Cale and his mom exit the house safely. A few days later, we see Cale getting his ankle bracelet removed by the detective. Cale, now a free man, spends the rest of his summer holidays with Ashley, enjoying every moment.